I was sitting on my weathered dock with a cold beer in hand, watching the sunset paint Lake Travis orange and pink, when I saw Deborah Walsh marching down the gravel path toward my property with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. That walk meant trouble. As the president of Lakeshore Estates, HOA, Deborah had perfected the art of finding problems where none existed, but the look on her face told me this was going to be worse than usual. "Zachary Lawson," she called out, her voice sharp enough to scare off the ducks floating near my dock. "We need to talk about this." She gestured dramatically at my dock, the same one that had been here for 37 years, built by my grandfather when he first bought this land back in 1988. I took a slow sip of my beer and stood up, feeling the old boards creak beneath my feet. "What about it, Deborah?" "The HOA board conducted an inspection yesterday, and your dock is in violation of multiple codes." She flipped through papers on her clipboard with theatrical precision. "The wood is weathered beyond acceptable standards. There are gaps between the boards exceeding safety parameters, and the entire structure appears to be a liability." I looked down at my dock. Sure, it was old, but it was solid. My grandfather had built it with treated lumber that could outlast most modern construction. I had maintained it myself over the years, replacing boards when needed, keeping it safe and functional. "Deborah, this dock has been here longer than your HOA has existed." "That's irrelevant." She thrust a paper at me. "You have 14 days to bring it into compliance or face fines of $500 per day. If you fail to comply within 30 days, the HOA will condemn the structure and have it removed at your expense." I took the paper, scanning the violations listed. "Weathered appearance? That's not a safety violation. Gaps between boards for water drainage? That's by design. This is ridiculous. The standards are clearly outlined in the HOA covenant, which you agreed to when you joined the community." "I never joined anything," I said, my voice harder now. "My grandfather bought this land in 1988. Your precious Lakeshore Estates development didn't even break ground until 2003. I was grandfathered in when you all built around me." Deborah's lips pursed into a thin line. "Your property became part of the HOA district when the boundaries were established. You received notice at that time." "A notice I never agreed to," I countered. "You can't just absorb someone's property into your HOA without their consent." "Take it up with your lawyer, Mr. Lawson. You have 14 days. She turned on her heel and marched back up the path, leaving me standing there with a violation notice that felt like a declaration of war. I walked back to my house, a modest 2-story cabin that my grandfather had also built, and spread the papers out on my kitchen table. The violation notice listed 14 different infractions, most of them cosmetic or completely fabricated. But what caught my attention was the section about the dock extending into HOA-managed waterfront. That was new language. For 20 years since the development went up around me, there had been tensions about my property, but nobody had ever claimed jurisdiction over the actual waterfront. I pulled out my property deed, the original one from 1988, and started reading through it carefully. My grandfather had been meticulous about documentation. He'd been a lawyer himself before he retired, and he made sure everything was in order. The property description included all shoreline rights extending to the navigable depth of Lake Travis, including submerged land to a depth of 10 feet from the mean water line. That language meant something. I grabbed my laptop and started researching. Texas property law regarding lakefront property was complex, but one thing became clear as I read through statute after statute. When my grandfather bought this land, he had purchased not just the visible shore, but the rights to the submerged land extending into the lake. That was common practice back then, before the state started regulating lakefront development more strictly. I looked at a survey map of the area, comparing it to the property description in my deed. My shoreline rights extended in a curve following the natural contour of the land, stretching roughly 200 feet into the lake at its deepest point. And sitting right in the middle of that zone was the Lakeshore Estates Marina. The HOA's fancy marina, with its 60 boat slips, fuel dock, and clubhouse, was built entirely on land I technically owned. I sat back in my chair, a slow smile spreading across my face. Deborah Walsh wanted to play hardball about my dock? Fine. But she had no idea what game she had just started. The next morning, I drove into Austin to meet with Thomas Kruger, a property attorney who had handled some boundary dispute work for my neighbor a few years back. His office was in one of those restored historic buildings downtown, all exposed brick and modern furniture, trying to look casual. "Zachary, good to see you," Thomas said, shaking my hand. He was in his 50s, with gray hair and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "You said this was about an HOA dispute?" I laid out the situation, showing him the violation notice in my property deed. He read through everything carefully, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. "This is interesting," he said finally. "Very interesting. Your grandfather really did his homework when he bought this property. This deed gives you riparian rights that extend well into the lake." Riparian rights? The rights of a landowner to use and access water adjacent to their property. In Texas, if you own lakefront property, you typically own to the edge of the water. But in some cases, especially with artificial reservoirs like Lake Travis, early buyers could purchase rights to the submerged land as well. Your grandfather did exactly that. So the Marina. Thomas pulled up a county GIS map on his computer, overlaying my property boundaries. If this deed is accurate, and I have no reason to believe it isn't, then yes. The Lakeshore Estates Marina is sitting on your submerged property. They would need an easement or lease agreement to use it. Which they don't have. "Which they don't have," Thomas confirmed. "This is going to get complicated, Zachary. HOAs don't like being wrong, and they really don't like losing power struggles. Are you prepared for this to get ugly?" I thought about my grandfather, about the hours he spent teaching me to fish from that dock, about the summers maintaining it together. They came after my dock. They started this. "Then let's do this properly." Thomas started typing on his computer. "First, I need to verify the deed with the county. Then we need to get a professional survey done to establish the exact boundaries. Once we have that, we can proceed with notifying the HOA of the issue." "How long will that take?" "The survey, a week, maybe 2. I know a good firm that can prioritize it. In the meantime, I'll send a response to the HOA's violation notice. We'll contest the violations and put them on notice that we're reviewing property boundaries." I left Thomas's office feeling like I had a plan, but I also knew Deborah Walsh wasn't going to back down easily. She had been HOA president for 6 years, ruling over Lakeshore Estates like her personal fiefdom. Having someone challenge her authority was going to trigger a reaction. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, I found another notice on my door. This one wasn't about the dock, it was about my lawn height, claiming my grass exceeded the maximum allowed height of 3 inches. I measured my lawn. It was 2.5 inches. I took photos with a ruler for scale and sent them to Thomas. The day after that, I got a notice about my mailbox being non-compliant with community standards. My mailbox was identical to every other mailbox in the neighborhood. We had all bought them from the same hardware store when the HOA mandated a uniform style 5 years ago. "She's harassing you," Thomas said when I called him. "Document everything. Take photos, keep all the notices. This establishes a pattern that will help us if this ends up in court." The survey team showed up on a Thursday morning, 2 guys with expensive equipment and a work order from Thomas's office. Deborah appeared within an hour, storming down from her house 3 properties up the road. "What is this?" she demanded, watching as the surveyors set up their equipment at my shoreline. "Property survey," I said calmly. "Just making sure all my boundaries are properly documented." "You can't just survey HOA common areas." "I'm surveying my property, Deborah. If the equipment happens to be near the water, that's because my property includes the waterfront." Her face flushed red. "The waterfront belongs to the HOA. It's part of the common areas." "According to what?" "According to the covenant." "Show me," I said. "Show me the documentation that proves the HOA owns the waterfront." She sputtered, unable to produce anything on the spot. "This is ridiculous. I'm calling our attorney." "You do that," I said, turning back to watch the surveyors work. The survey took 2 full days. The team used GPS equipment to map out the exact boundaries described in my deed, cross-referencing with county records and historical maps. When they were done, Thomas came out personally to review the results. "It's even better than we thought," he said, spreading the survey map across my kitchen table. "Your submerged property rights extend in an arc from your shoreline. The marina sits almost entirely within your boundaries. Of the 60 boat slips, 58 are on your property. The fuel dock is on your property. The clubhouse is actually on HOA land, but the dock extending from it crosses onto your property. I stared at the map, hardly believing it. The whole marina. The whole marina, Thomas confirmed. And here's the thing. They've been operating this marina for 18 years. They charge slip fees, sell fuel, run it as a profit center for the HOA, all on your property, without your permission. What are my options? Thomas leaned back in his chair. Several. You could demand they cease operations immediately. You could negotiate a lease agreement where they pay you for use of the land. You could sue for back payment for all the years they've used your property without authorization. Or you could use this as leverage to get them to back off about your dock and leave you alone. What would you recommend? Honestly, start with a formal notice. Inform them of the property boundaries and demand they cease unauthorized use of your land. See how they respond. Some HOAs will be reasonable when faced with clear legal facts. Others will fight. I thought about Deborah Walsh and her clipboard, her pursed lips and her power trips. This HOA is going to fight. Then we'll be ready. Thomas drafted a formal notice, a 6-page letter detailing the property boundaries, citing the relevant statutes and including a certified copy of the survey. The letter demanded that the Lakeshore Estates HOA cease all operations on my property within 30 days and contact Thomas's office to discuss either removal of the structures or negotiation of a formal lease agreement. We sent it certified mail to the HOA's registered agent and to Deborah Walsh personally. Then we waited. I didn't have to wait long for a response, though it wasn't the one I expected. 2 days after the letters were delivered, I woke up to find my dock wrapped in red tape with a large condemned sign nailed to the post. 2 men in reflective vests were taking photos of the structure. I walked down in my pajamas and bare feet. What's going on? One of the men, a younger guy with a sunburn already forming on his neck, looked up from his clipboard. HOA ordered an emergency condemnation. Structure has been deemed unsafe. It's got to come down within 48 hours or we're authorized to remove it at property owner expense. On whose authority? HOA board voted unanimously last night. Emergency session. Let me see the documentation. He handed me a packet. Inside was a notice of emergency board meeting held at 8 p.m. the previous night. The agenda listed only one item: emergency condemnation of unsafe dock structure at 1247 Lakeshore Drive. My address. The meeting minutes showed all 5 board members voted yes. There was no mention of any inspection, no structural engineer's report, nothing but their decision. This is retaliation, I said. The sunburned guy shrugged. I just follow orders, man. You got a problem? Take it up with the board. I called Thomas immediately. He answered on the second ring, and I could hear traffic in the background. They condemned my dock, I told him. Emergency board meeting last night. They're saying I have 48 hours to remove it. Did they provide any engineering reports, structural assessments, anything like that? Nothing, just their vote. That's not legal, Thomas said. You can't condemn a structure without proper assessment. I'll file for an emergency injunction this morning. Don't let them touch that dock. They said 48 hours. I'll have the injunction within 24. Just sit tight and don't engage with them. The injunction came through that afternoon. Thomas drove out personally to deliver it to the men in reflective vests, who were now setting up scaffolding around my dock, preparing to dismantle it. They packed up their equipment and left without a word. Deborah appeared an hour later, her face so red I thought she might have a stroke. You can't do this, she shouted from my driveway. That dock is a safety hazard. I walked out onto my porch, keeping my distance. According to what assessment? According to the board. The board isn't qualified to make structural assessments. You need a licensed engineer to condemn a structure. We have every right to maintain safety standards in this community. Not on my property, you don't. And speaking of property, Deborah, did you get the letter from my attorney? Her expression shifted, some of the anger replaced by uncertainty. That letter is nonsense. Your grandfather didn't own the lake. No, but he owned the submerged land extending into the lake, which means your marina is sitting on my property, has been for 18 years. That's impossible. The survey and deed are clear. You're operating a commercial marina on my land without my permission. That's trespassing. Our attorney says your claim is invalid. Then your attorney is wrong, but you're welcome to waste your money fighting it in court. I turned to go back inside, then paused. Oh, and Deborah. Every day that Marina operates on my property without authorization, I'm calculating damages. We're currently at about 18 years of unpaid lease fees, plus profits from slip rentals and fuel sales. The number's getting pretty substantial. I went inside and closed the door, leaving her standing in my driveway. Through the window, I watched her pull out her phone and make a call, her free hand gesturing wildly. That evening, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I let it go to voicemail. The message was from Richard Pearson, identifying himself as the attorney for Lakeshore Estates HOA. He wanted to discuss the property matter and suggested we meet to find a reasonable resolution. I forwarded the voicemail to Thomas, who called me back within minutes. "They're scared," he said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Good. Let them sweat for a few days. We'll respond next week and set up a meeting. In the meantime, I'm going to start calculating what fair market value would be for leasing that submerged property. If they want to negotiate, we're going to negotiate from a position of strength." The weekend was quiet, which made me nervous. In my experience, Deborah Walsh didn't do quiet. She did loud, aggressive, and vindictive. When she went silent, she was planning something. Sunday afternoon, I found out what. I was grilling burgers on my back deck when I saw boats pulling up to the Marina, more than usual for a lazy Sunday. People were gathering on the dock, maybe 40 or 50 HOA residents, all talking and pointing toward my property. Then I saw Deborah at the center of it all, holding what looked like a megaphone. I walked down to my Shoreline, curious about what fresh drama she was brewing. "That man," Deborah's voice boomed across the water, "is trying to steal our marina. He's making fraudulent claims about owning the lake, and he's threatening to shut down a facility that belongs to all of us," the crowd murmured angrily. I recognized some of my neighbors in the group, people I'd waved to at the grocery store, folks I'd helped when their boats broke down. "The HOA has been a good steward of this waterfront for nearly 2 decades, Deborah continued. "We've maintained it, improved it, made it a valuable amenity for everyone in Lakeshore Estates, and now this man wants to take it away from us." "That's not what's happening," I shouted across the water. Deborah turned her megaphone toward me. "Isn't it? You're claiming you own the lake. I'm claiming I own the submerged land the marina is built on, which I do. My grandfather bought it in 1988, decades before your development existed. The deed is clear." "He's lying," someone in the crowd shouted. "Check the county records," I shouted back. "The survey is on file. The deed is public record. I'm not making this up." But the crowd wasn't interested in facts. They were interested in their marina, their boat slips, their weekend convenience. Deborah had turned this into an us versus him situation, and I was the villain in her story. Thomas was not happy when I called him that evening and described the scene. "She's poisoning the well," he said, "turning the community against you to put pressure on you to back down. It's a common tactic." "Is it working?" "That depends. Are you planning to back down?" I thought about my grandfather's dock, about the red condemnation tape, about Deborah's smug face as she handed me that first violation notice. "No." "Then it doesn't matter. But Zachary, you need to be careful. When HOAs get desperate, they sometimes do stupid things. Make sure your property is secure. Consider installing cameras if you don't have them already." "You think she'd vandalize something?" "I think desperate people make bad decisions. Just be careful." I took his advice and ordered security cameras that night, paying extra for next-day delivery. They arrived Monday afternoon, and I spent the evening installing them around my property, covering all angles of the dock, my yard, and my house. Tuesday morning, the cameras proved their worth. At 3:47 a.m., motion sensors triggered alerts on my phone. I woke up and checked the feeds to see 2 figures in dark clothing approaching my dock. They were carrying something, but the darkness made it hard to see exactly what. I grabbed my phone and called 911, then pulled on jeans and a jacket and headed outside with a flashlight. "Police are on the way," I shouted as I approached. "Get off my property." The figures dropped what they were carrying and ran. My flashlight caught one of them in profile, enough for me to see it was a young man, maybe early 20s. They disappeared into the trees that bordered my property, heading back toward the main development. I walked down to my dock to see what they had dropped. It was a portable power saw and a pry bar. They had been planning to dismantle my dock themselves. The Travis County Sheriff's deputy arrived 15 minutes later, a tired-looking woman in her 40s who took my statement and reviewed the camera footage on my phone. "You recognize either of these individuals?" she asked. "One of them looks like he might be Kyle Watson, lives 2 streets over, but I can't be certain." "We'll follow up." She took photos of the tools which still lay on my dock. "You're pressing charges if we identify them?" "Absolutely," she nodded approvingly. "Good. People need to learn they can't just take matters into their own hands. I'll write this up and be in touch." After she left, I stood on my dock and watched the sun come up over Lake Travis. The water was perfectly still, reflecting the orange and pink sky. This place had been my refuge for my entire life, the spot where I came to think and heal and find peace. Now it was a battleground, and I was tired of fighting, but I wasn't going to surrender. Thomas filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office about the attempted vandalism, including the camera footage. He also filed a motion in Travis County District Court seeking a restraining order against the HOA, prohibiting them from taking any action against my dock or property, pending resolution of the boundary dispute. The hearing was scheduled for the following Thursday. In the meantime, Deborah went silent again, which worried me more than her megaphone had. Wednesday afternoon, I got my answer to what she'd been planning. A process server showed up at my door with a lawsuit. The Lakeshore Estates HOA was suing me for interference with HOA operations, harassment, and making fraudulent property claims. They were seeking damages of $500,000 plus attorney fees. I called Thomas immediately. "It's a slap suit," he said after I read him the complaint. "Strategic lawsuit against public participation. They're suing you not because they think they'll win, but to intimidate you and drain your resources fighting it. The good news is Texas has strong anti-slap laws. We can file a motion to dismiss and potentially recover our attorney fees." "How long will this take?" "Months, probably, but don't let it discourage you. This actually works in our favor because it shows they're desperate. No HOA with a strong legal position would file something this transparent." The restraining order hearing Thursday morning was my first time seeing inside a courtroom since a speeding ticket 10 years ago. Judge Margaret Chen presided, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who read through the filings with obvious impatience. Deborah sat in the gallery with Richard Pearson, her attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. Thomas presented our case efficiently. He showed the deed, the survey, the photos of the condemned dock, and the camera footage of the attempted vandalism. "Your Honor, this is a clear case of HOA, overreach and retaliation," Thomas said. "Mr. Lawson asserted his legitimate property rights, and the HOA responded by condemning his dock without proper assessment and mobilizing community members to vandalize his property. He's seeking a restraining order to prevent further harassment while the property dispute is resolved." Judge Chen turned to Richard Pearson. "Counselor, does your client dispute the validity of Mr. Lawson's deed?" Pearson stood, adjusting his tie. "Your Honor, we believe the deed language is ambiguous and that the submerged land in question was never validly conveyed to Mr. Lawson's grandfather. We're prepared to litigate that issue fully." "That's not what I asked. Do you dispute that the deed exists and contains the language Mr. Lawson's attorney has presented?" "No, Your Honor. And did the HOA board vote to condemn Mr. Lawson's dock without obtaining a structural engineering report?" Pearson hesitated. "The board acted based on visual inspection and concern for community safety." "That's a yes." Judge Chen flipped through more papers. "And these security camera images show individuals attempting to vandalize the dock at 3:47 a.m.? "We have no evidence those individuals were acting on behalf of the HOA," Pearson said quickly. "No one suggested they were," the judge replied dryly. "Though the timing is certainly interesting. Mr. Pearson, I'm granting the restraining order. The HOA is prohibited from taking any action against Mr. Lawson's dock or property pending resolution of the boundary dispute. That includes fines, condemnation proceedings, or any other enforcement actions." If your client has concerns about the dock's safety, they can hire an independent structural engineer to conduct an assessment. If that assessment shows genuine safety issues, we can revisit this. But no more midnight condemnations. Clear? Yes, Your Honor. Good. Hearing adjourned. I walked out of the courthouse, feeling like I'd won a small victory. But Thomas brought me back to reality quickly. This is just the beginning, he said as we stood by his car. They're going to fight the property boundary issue hard. That's going to be expensive and time-consuming. Are you sure you want to proceed? I looked back at the courthouse, thinking about my grandfather, about the dock he built with his own hands. I'm sure. Then we need to discuss strategy. We can approach this a few ways. We can file our own lawsuit to establish clear title to the submerged land and seek damages for their unauthorized use. Or we can wait for them to make the next move and respond defensively. What's your goal here, Zachary? Do you want money, or do you want them off your land? I want them to leave me alone, I said. I don't care about their marina. They can keep using it as far as I'm concerned. I just want them to drop this nonsense about my dock and stop harassing me. Thomas nodded slowly. Then maybe it's time to see if they're willing to negotiate. Let me reach out to Pearson, feel out whether they're ready to be reasonable. Sometimes people need to lose in court before they're willing to talk. Over the next week, the neighborhood tension escalated. Someone spray-painted "thief" on my mailbox. My garbage cans were knocked over 3 times. I got anonymous letters calling me greedy and selfish. The camera footage showed it was different people each time, none of them Deborah herself, but all of them clearly riled up by her campaign. I reported each incident to the sheriff's office, building a record. Deputy Martinez, who had responded to the attempted vandalism, became a regular visitor to my property. "This is getting out of hand," she said after the 3rd mailbox incident. "Have you considered asking the HOA to issue a statement telling people to back off? You think Deborah Walsh is going to do that? Probably not, but it's worth documenting that you asked. If someone gets hurt or does serious damage, it'll matter that you tried to de-escalate." I took her advice and sent a formal letter to the HOA board, requesting they issue a statement condemning the harassment and vandalism. The response came from Richard Pearson's office 3 days later. It was 2 sentences long. The HOA takes no responsibility for the actions of individual community members. Your property dispute does not entitle you to make demands of the board. Thomas made contact with Pearson around the same time, proposing a meeting to discuss potential resolution. Pearson agreed, and we scheduled it for the following Tuesday at his office in Austin. The morning of the meeting, I wore my one good suit, the one I'd bought for my grandfather's funeral 8 years ago. Thomas met me in the parking lot of Pearson's building, a glass tower in the downtown business district. "Remember," Thomas said as we walked to the elevator, "we're here to listen more than talk. Let them make the first offer. Don't get emotional, no matter what they say." Pearson's conference room had windows overlooking the city, all glass and steel and expensive furniture. Deborah was already there, sitting ramrod straight in a leather chair. Next to her were 2 other board members I recognized, Frank Morrison, the treasurer, and Linda Zhang, the secretary. Pearson sat at the head of the table. "Gentlemen, thank you for coming," Pearson began. "I think we can all agree this situation has become unproductive for everyone involved. My clients are prepared to discuss a reasonable resolution." "We're listening," Thomas said. Deborah leaned forward. "We're willing to drop all violations against your dock and cease enforcement actions if you withdraw your property claims regarding the marina." "That's not reasonable," Thomas replied immediately. "My client isn't making claims. He's asserting documented property rights supported by a deed and survey. You're asking him to surrender legitimate property in exchange for you stopping illegal harassment." "The property rights are disputed," Pearson interjected. "Only by you. The county recognizes the deed. The survey is clear. There's no legitimate dispute here, just your client's unwillingness to acknowledge reality." Frank Morrison spoke up, his voice calmer than Deborah's. "Look, we understand there might be some validity to the historical property boundaries, but the HOA has operated that marina for 18 years. We've invested hundreds of thousands of dollars into improvements. Our residents rely on it. What do you want from us?" That was a better question, more honest. I looked at Thomas, who nodded slightly, giving me permission to speak. "I want to be left alone," I said. My grandfather built that dock. It's important to me. I maintain it, it's safe, and it's on my property. I don't want your HOA telling me how to live on land my family has owned for nearly 40 years. As for the marina, I don't care about it. You can keep using it. I'm not trying to shut it down. Then what are you trying to do? Linda Zhang asked. I'm trying to get you to understand that you don't have authority over me or my property. You can't just condemn my dock because Deborah doesn't like how it looks. You can't fine me for grass that isn't too tall or mailboxes that match everyone else's. I'm not your subject. Deborah's face flushed. Everyone in Lakeshore Estates has to follow the same rules. I'm not in Lakeshore Estates, I said, my voice harder now. My property existed before your development. You built around me. You don't get to absorb my land into your jurisdiction just because it's convenient for you. That's not how HOAs work, she snapped. Then maybe your HOA shouldn't have been formed to include property that wasn't part of your development, Thomas said. But that's a separate issue. Let's focus on resolution. My client is willing to grant you a formal easement to continue operating the marina on his submerged property. The terms would be simple. The HOA acknowledges his property boundaries, ceases all enforcement actions against his property, and agrees not to assess fees or fines against him in the future. In exchange, he grants you the right to continue using the marina. An easement could be revoked, Pearson said. Then we can structure it as a 99-year lease at $1 per year. The point is establishing clear boundaries and getting your client to back off. Deborah stood up abruptly. This is extortion. You're using that marina as leverage to exempt yourself from community standards. We're using his property rights to establish that he was never legitimately subject to your community standards, Thomas corrected. There's a difference. The meeting deteriorated from there. Deborah refused to agree to anything that exempted me from HOA oversight, even though my property had never legitimately been part of the HOA to begin with. Pearson tried to moderate, suggesting various compromises, but Deborah shot them all down. We left after an hour with no resolution. She's going to force this into court, Thomas said as we walked back to our cars. Some people can't accept not being in control. So what's next? We file our lawsuit. Quiet title action to establish clear ownership of the submerged land, plus injunctive relief to permanently prohibit HOA enforcement on your property. We'll also countersue on their SLAPP suit and seek attorney fees. It's going to be expensive and take months, but I don't see another option. Do it, I said. Thomas filed the lawsuit the following Monday. The complaint laid out everything: the deed history, the survey results, the HOA's unauthorized use of my property, and their retaliatory actions against my dock. We asked the court to declare clear title to the submerged land, grant a permanent injunction against HOA enforcement on my property, award damages for 18 years of unauthorized use of my land, and dismiss the HOA's SLAPP suit with prejudice. The amount we were seeking in damages was substantial. Thomas had researched comparable marina leases on Lake Travis and calculated that fair market value for 60 boat slips would have been approximately $8,000 per month. Over 18 years, that added up to more than $1.7 million. I didn't expect to actually get that money, but I hoped the number would be scary enough to bring the HOA back to the negotiating table. Instead, it made things worse. The lawsuit became public record, and local media picked up the story. Lakefront property dispute pits landowner against HOA, read the headline in the Austin American-Statesman. The article was fairly balanced, presenting both sides, but the comments section was brutal. People who didn't know me or the situation were calling me greedy, saying I was trying to steal the marina, accusing me of harassing a community organization. Deborah gave an interview to a local TV station, standing in front of the marina, and talking about how one man's greed was threatening a community amenity enjoyed by hundreds of families. She never mentioned my dock or the harassment campaign or any of the context. I got death threats in my mailbox. My truck's tires were slashed. Someone threw a rock through my kitchen window at 2 a.m. Every incident was captured on camera, and every incident was reported to the sheriff's office. But the vandals were getting smarter about hiding their faces. Deputy Martinez suggested I consider staying somewhere else for a while, just until things calmed down. I refused. This was my home, and I wasn't going to be driven out of it. The case slowly worked its way through the court system. Discovery was contentious, with both sides demanding documents and depositions. I spent 6 hours being questioned by Richard Pearson, who tried every angle to get me to admit my property claims were motivated by greed or spite. I stuck to the truth. I was defending my property rights and trying to stop HOA harassment. Deborah's deposition was more interesting. Thomas questioned her for 8 hours over 2 sessions, and she grew increasingly combative as he pressed her on the details of the dock condemnation, the emergency board meeting, and the lack of engineering assessment. "You never hired a structural engineer to inspect Mr. Lawson's dock before condemning it, did you?" Thomas asked. "We didn't need to. The violations were obvious." "What are your qualifications to assess structural safety?" "I have eyes. I can see when something is unsafe. But you have no engineering degree, no construction background, no relevant expertise." "I don't need expertise to see a hazard." "Did any of the board members who voted to condemn the dock have relevant expertise?" Deborah hesitated. "We consulted with our property manager." "Who also has no engineering background, correct?" "This is ridiculous. The dock is old and dangerous." "Has anyone been injured on Mr. Lawson's dock, ever?" "Not that I know of, but has Mr. Lawson's dock failed any legitimate inspection?" "We don't recognize it as legitimate." Thomas let that answer hang in the air for a moment before continuing. The deposition transcript was going to be damaging for the HOA. 6 months into the litigation, with both sides having spent tens of thousands of dollars in legal fees, Pearson reached out to Thomas about settlement discussions. We met again at his office, same conference room, same view. This time, Deborah wasn't there. Instead, Frank Morrison and 2 other board members represented the HOA. That was a good sign. The board was meeting without their president. "We want to settle this," Frank said directly. "Deborah doesn't speak for all of us, and frankly, several board members are concerned about where this is heading." "What are you proposing?" Thomas asked. "We'll acknowledge your property boundaries and grant a full exemption from HOA oversight. No fees, no assessments, no enforcement actions. You grant us a 99-year lease for the Marina at nominal consideration. Both sides dismiss their lawsuits with prejudice. Clean slate." "What about damages for past use of his property?" Thomas asked. Frank sighed. "We don't have $1.7 million. The HOA's operating budget barely covers maintenance and common area upkeep. A judgment like that would bankrupt us." "That's not my client's problem," Thomas said, but his tone was gentle. "You operated on his land without permission for 18 years. "We didn't know," one of the other board members said. "The developer told us the HOA owned the waterfront rights. We relied on that in good faith." "Then sue your developer," Thomas suggested. "But that doesn't change the fact that you used Mr. Lawson's property without authorization." We negotiated for 3 hours. Eventually, we reached a compromise. The HOA would pay me $200,000, which was roughly what they had in reserve funds. They would acknowledge my property boundaries and exempt my property from all HOA oversight permanently. I would grant them the 99-year lease for the Marina. Both sides would dismiss their lawsuits and sign mutual non-disparagement agreements. It wasn't everything I'd asked for, but it was fair. More importantly, it was over. "I need to get board approval," Frank said. "We'll have to hold a vote." "What about Deborah?" I asked. Frank and the other board members exchanged glances. "Deborah is being asked to resign," Frank said carefully. "After the depositions and some internal discussions, the board has lost confidence in her leadership. This lawsuit never should have happened. If she had handled your initial concerns reasonably, we could have avoided all of this." The board vote was held the following week. 4 members voted to approve the settlement, Deborah voted against it, and submitted her resignation the same day. The legal paperwork took another month to finalize. Thomas made sure every detail was perfect. The property boundaries were clearly defined, the lease was ironclad, and the exemption from HOA oversight was absolute and permanent. We recorded everything with the county to make sure future board members couldn't try to revive the dispute. The $200,000 check arrived on a Thursday afternoon. I deposited it and immediately wrote a check to Thomas for his fees, which were substantial but fair. The rest I put into a trust fund designated for maintaining the dock and my property. The harassment stopped as soon as the settlement was announced. No more vandalism, no more threatening letters, no more slashed tires. It was like someone had flipped a switch. The neighbors who had glared at me in the grocery store went back to polite waves. People started using the marina again without giving me angry looks. Deborah left Lakeshore Estates entirely. I heard through the neighborhood gossip chain that she and her husband bought a condo in downtown Austin. Frank Morrison was elected as the new HOA president and ran the organization much more reasonably, focusing on actual community maintenance rather than petty enforcement. 6 months after the settlement, I was sitting on my dock watching the sunset, same as I had been the day Deborah first appeared with her clipboard. The wood beneath me was solid, the same boards my grandfather had laid down decades ago. I'd given the whole dock a fresh coat of sealant a few weeks earlier, more out of pride than necessity. A boat puttered up to the marina, a young family unloading fishing gear and coolers. They waved to me, and I waved back. The marina hummed with activity, people enjoying the lake on a beautiful evening. It didn't bother me that they were technically on my property. The lake was meant to be enjoyed, and as long as nobody was trying to tell me how to live my life, I didn't care who else was out there. My phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. County just processed the final documents. Everything is recorded. You're officially exempt from HOA, oversight in perpetuity. Congratulations. I texted back a thank you and set my phone aside. The sun was setting over Lake Travis, painting the water golden orange. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear music playing from one of the boats, laughter carrying across the water. I cracked open a cold beer and leaned back against the dock post, feeling the weathered wood against my spine. This dock had stood here for 37 years, through storms and drought and all the changes that came with time. It would stand here for another 37, and beyond that if I had anything to say about it. Deborah Walsh had tried to take this place from me, tried to use her clipboard and her rules and her righteous indignation to make me surrender something that had never been hers to claim. She had forgotten that property rights matter, that legal documents matter, that you can't just will yourself into having authority over other people's lives. In the end, she had learned an expensive lesson. The HOA had learned it too. And me? I had learned that sometimes standing your ground was worth it, even when it was hard, even when it got ugly. The marina lights flickered on as dusk settled over the lake. Somewhere in that marina, on those docks built on my property, families were making memories just like my grandfather and I had made on this very dock decades ago. That was fine. That was good even. But they would never again try to tell me what I could or couldn't do with my own property. They would never again show up with clipboards and violation notices and threats. Because now everyone knew what I had known all along. This was my land, my dock, my home. And no HOA in the world could change that. I watched the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky, feeling at peace for the first time in months. The legal battle had been exhausting, expensive, and often infuriating. But sitting here now, on my grandfather's dock, with my property rights firmly established and protected, I knew it had been worth every penny and every sleepless night. The HOA had forgotten their entire marina sat on my shoreline. They had learned to remember. And that made all the difference.